This week on Jared Scott Outdoors, I'm out with my son Luke after cow elk. The weapon for this hunt? A muzzleloader. This adventure took place the first part of December when there was plenty of snow up high and very little down low. This hunt happens when the elk have herded back up and for the most part have come down into some lower elevations. That can make the hunt easier, but with so many eyes, the hard part is usually not finding the elk, but getting in close enough for a shot. With that, let me show you how a slam dunk hunt took one unexpected turn after another. So the first part of our plan was just to head up to a high vantage point, just a short hike from the end of the dirt road. We grabbed our packs and the gun just in case there were elk nearby and headed up. Unfortunately, after a lot of glassing distant hillsides, we couldn't find a single elk.
Before we drop down to the truck again, there's just one little pocket that I want to go look at because while we were hiking up there was a lot of tracks in the snow. So I think there's got to be some elk around here. So we'll do one more little climb and go see if they happen to be in this other area.
As we crested over the hill we were hiking that allowed us to see into the next draw, we were surprised to see a bunch of elk on the opposite finger ridge from us, 500 or 600 yards off. As we glassed them up a bit, we realized that there were a lot of elk.
From what we can tell here, we've got a great little stock that we can put in on these.
So the plan was to backtrack a bit and hike up the back side of the ridge to stay out of sight. We could hike up to our right and get above them on the ridge they were on. Then we could hike down the ridge until this knob, and from there, hopefully be in range for a shot. Looked pretty simple. Since Luke was wearing his regular camo for an outer layer, before we headed up, he pulled out his snow camo that would be more important to have when we were getting in close for the shot, especially as we expected to be skylined with this plan.
Let's go shoot an elk.
Keeping out of sight, we backed out and made a long route out of it. It was easy enough to keep out of sight as long as we were careful, but it was the steep, slick hillside that slowed us down a lot. Any higher up the hillside than this, and we were in sight of the elk. So we just picked our way side-hilling across as we made it to the next ridge the elk were on. When we got up to these big rocks, we used them as cover to peek over the top to make sure the elk were still around. And sure enough, they were still there. Dropping back out of sight, we continued on up to close the gap. Now it didn't take long to get in close enough that it was time to pull out the muzzleloader and get it ready for a possible shot. Luke put on the cap, and now it was time to get serious.
It's time to put them on stock.
As we closed in, I wanted to go to the right side of the ridge to stay out of sight of those elk that were bedded down right on top. However, we were stopped short when I spotted a lot of elk feeding down below us a few hundred yards away. They were in plain sight, but still well out of range, and there was no easy way to get in closer to them. Quickly changing our game plan, we had to stay right on top of the ridge and see if we could still get in close enough to those other elk we'd first seen. Taking our time, we got as close as we could with the little cover we had. Then I took off my pack and crept up a little closer. That spot didn't work out well at all, but I saw a gap we could crawl to in order to get a little closer and have a better view. As we got there and glassed the elk, all we could see were those that were the furthest out. They were still over 300 yards. I'm sure the closest elk were close enough for a shot, but the elk were so spread out that we were finding it hard to get in close enough without being seen by those elk that were further away. As I looked back to our right, those elk that had been there had now moved back with the rest of the elk. That meant we could now drop off to the right side again and use that for cover to move in. Doing so, we hurried over the last bit of cover. I ranged the elk that were visible, but they were still 200 yards out. I knew there were elk closer by, but we couldn't see them without being seen by all those elk you see now. We tried everything we could to get in closer and finally found a spot that was 90 yards from the closest elk. We would have to get up and shoot quickly because we'd be in plain sight to those elk that are further out. Just when we were getting the shooting sticks up for the shot, all the elk that were bedded stood up and started heading downhill and slightly towards us. This, however, put them out of sight. Something had spooked them and we weren't sure what it was. We had an idea of where they'd go, so we quickly grabbed our stuff and headed over to cut them off. Sure enough, it worked just as we thought. Luke set up with a dead rest on the rock, and the elk started filing out into view. At this point, they were 150 yards, but 100 yards would be ideal. Instead of continuing on closer, however, they started to work straight away and over the edge of the draw. As you can see, there were a lot of elk now, and the closer ones were only about 120 yards. We could deal with that, but as you can see, there were so many of them that we had no clean shot at just a single elk. As they continued to file by, we just figured eventually a single elk would present itself, and just like we thought, one did.
Do you see that one? That one's not a spike. Yeah, if you want. Wait, there's one behind it now.
Well, we realized what had spooked the elk when a shot rang out from the direction they had come from. Now the elk were on edge and really started moving quickly. Luke just had to be ready, as now we had only the stragglers left. With the last group of elk visible, a lone bull made picking out a single cow to shoot that much more difficult. And just like that, our shot opportunity quickly disintegrated as all the elk ran down the draw. Not giving up, we took off running. If we could get to that draw and get a shot before they climbed back up and out of range, maybe this would still work.
Top of this one. Look at that.
By the time we were there, of course, some were well over 300 yards off, but the closest ones right at the bottom of the draw were still only 130 yards. If we could isolate a cow elk, he could get a shot.
Or the one to the left of it, either one. Just take one, any one.
We were still hearing a lot of shooting going on, which was odd because these elk were well out of range of where these other hunters should be. Either way, with all that, it made it where the elk weren't holding still as they were trying to hurry out of there. And the need to make sure that Luke was aiming at a cow elk and a little bit of hesitation on his end made it possible for all the elk to get out of range once again, with no shot being fired. Meanwhile, who had ever been taking those other shots were still shooting occasionally, even though the elk had to be 500 or 600 yards away from them. It sounded like a centerfire rifle, which was not legal for this hunt.
Later we found out there's a road on the other side of where they were, just an old 2-track, and somebody had driven right up it, and then from what we can tell, he just kind of hopped out and started shooting. And unfortunately, I could tell part of that was a high-powered rifle as those elk were running up the hill. So I'm not quite sure what was going on there. I don't think it was terribly legit. They took off without even hiking up and checking, to see if they had anything. So I don't even know what to say other than dang, right there, it just fell apart on us.
Well, even though the elk are clear up there, about 1,000 more feet, we're still going to go try and sneak up on them and pick one off, but we'll see what happens.
As I freeze the frame here, you can see where we were heading. The elk headed up the canyon into the trees here, so we were going to go loop around up beyond them and above them here. There was nothing to do but go ahead and start the hike. The only bad thing about going after these elk is that since we weren't planning on hiking up that far when we left the truck, we'd left our lunch in the truck. All we had between us was 2 granola bars. Hopefully we could get the tag filled on our next try. Looking down below, you can see that the heavy fog that had settled in the valley was still just as thick as ever. Looking up, we could see we were gaining ground.
The elk are up there, so we're going up there.
We made good time once we hit a solid game trail and made it over to the saddle quicker than I thought. I was hoping that we had gone beyond and above the elk. However, as we came to a spot that gave us a vantage point over a little break, I spotted the last of the elk feeding across a small clearing above us even further out. It looked like we could still get close enough for a shot if we could hurry over before they all passed through the clearing. So using the trees for cover, we took off as quickly as possible. We had several hundred yards to cover and made it to where I had hoped to be in range. However, as I ranged them, I found they were still 200 yards off. We had to get in closer. Slowly working in, we were able to get closer without getting caught. Now there were only 2 elk left, one that we could barely see, and another that was standing out in the open, perfect for a shot. This was Luke's chance. As quietly as possible, Luke set up the shooting sticks and positioned for a shot. It took a few minutes of moving around before he was stable and was clear of the branches that were between us and the elk. Finally, Luke said he was stable and good for the shot, and as luck would have it, that's exactly when the elk started to move.
Oh, you better shoot.
We couldn't believe it. Everything was looking so perfect. Luke realized that if he had another chance, he better not have any hesitation, because today that had meant a lost opportunity 2 times now. It had only fed away, so we just slowly worked our way up towards them. Then suddenly movement caught my eye to our left.
We had some deer that spooked on us when we're sneaking in again, and they got all the elk going. And now they've just gone up this mountain, and we've been trying to follow them, and we're so high now it's ridiculous.
We chased after these elk, but could never get more than a glimpse of them way on up ahead of us.
This is not what my dad said this would be like. We came out of the truck to go in glass, and we saw some elk, and we're all the way up here now.
Finally, we just figured we'd go for it. We just swung further around them, even higher up on the ridge. By now, it was nearing 3 p.m., and we still hadn't eaten anything all day. So needless to say, we were dragging a bit. We were both exhausted and just physically drained. Pushing a foot of snow up here near the top didn't help matters.
We have seen the elk. They're a little further down the ridge and then tucked down in the trees. So we're going to sneak along the ridge and hope we can see in there without spooking them to get a shot. Otherwise, we'll just have to walk in and try to get a shot. But we've spent enough of the daylight that we can't really waste time up here. We just got to get in there and make something happen.
Now we followed the ridge line around to where I'd seen the elk bedded up. When we found a bare spot of ground under a thick pine tree, we stopped and ate our one granola bar each and then quickly kept going. We were now down to just over an hour of light. We had to make something happen and happen fast. Being tired and pressed for time, I still couldn't resist taking just a minute to film this beautiful scene below us. Then it was back to the task at hand. It turned out that we couldn't see any of the elk from the ridge. There were just too many trees. So slipping slowly down, we spotted a couple elk bedded down about 200 yards off. We couldn't really see them well enough for a shot, but as we continued down, maybe we could get a better angle. We got to within range, but we could still just barely see small parts of them through the trees. Then our worst fear was realized when suddenly elk started running. We must have been caught by one we hadn't seen. Luke hurried and set up, but as you can see, with all the trees and fast-moving elk, there was no way he could get a clean shot. Well, with it being almost dark, all we could do was take off after them. It was so thick that we couldn't see them, but I started cow calling, and sure enough, they talked back. In fact, it seemed to slow them down a bit, as suddenly we had them talking above us, below us, and in front of us. Finally, as some elk passed by, Luke was able to quickly get set up, and this time, when he had an opportunity, he didn't hesitate.
Did you get him?
I think so. They were spooked and we did a couple of cow calls and they calmed down a bit and stopped. I was able to get a shot off, so hopefully I hit it.
With daylight fast disappearing, we couldn't wait. We slipped on down to where Luke said the elk had been, and sure enough, there were plenty of tracks, just no blood. While he was working on reloading the gun, I followed a handful of tracks in the direction he said they'd run after the shot. Sure enough, about 20 yards out, I spotted the telltale sign of red in the snow. I didn't tell Luke, I just told him to come my way.
Looks like you got him.
Or her, I guess.
It's right there. It's right in front of us.
That's a pretty good shot.
Yeah. All right, let's go check her out. Sweet.
Hallelujah. After the entire day.
I know, we don't have time to mess around now. Yeah, perfect shot. This was a hunt, oh my goodness. This was a frustrating one just because we got in on them so many times. And now we've got it down and the sun has already set. We should have had it packed up and in the truck by 1 o'clock. And instead it's going to be a late night. We're going to be skinning it in the dark and cold toes and cold body. And we'll be looking forward to hiking so we can warm up. But what do you think of that hunt, Luke?
It was fun. After it all came down, it was fun.
If we got back to the truck with nothing, oh, that would have been disappointing. But he made an excellent shot there. It was kind of a stressful, no time kind of deal, just moving there, spooked, cow calling. Hey, there's an elk, get in there, get the shot, and he drilled it. It only went like 50, 60 yards, which is exactly what we want to see. But way to go, Luke. Congratulations. That was quite the hunt there. I'll tell you what, some memories we will not soon forget.
If you liked what you saw, please subscribe to the Jared Scott Outdoors YouTube channel.